So it's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see a number of familiar faces in the audience, but also there's a lot of you that I don't know, and I hope to meet you at some point. And I'm delighted to come and be here and talk to you all. I just mentioned at the beginning that I am just coming off of a 2-hour lecture about environmental history, that it was more about the aesthetics of the idea of the sublime and wilderness. And so I'm trying to change my worldview to get to focus on the 20th century and talk a little bit about the wretched atom. So my most recent book before this was Arming Mother Nature, and which was sort of an exploration of the military dimensions of our way of thinking about the natural environment. And one of the things that happened in writing and then preparing and then trying to publicize that book was that I realized that people were interested in it. Not everyone, but a lot of the broader interest in it was in sort of a conspiratorial nature. People were really interested in the crazy ways that we imagined fighting World War III, and I suppose I understand that. You know, the idea of melting polar ice caps and using biological weapons and that sort of thing got a lot of interest. But then people would get in touch with me and talk about conspiracy theories, and one of the chapters of the book was excerpted on a website called salon.com, and the graphic that went along with it, there was a flying saucer, a UFO, and there were no aliens in that book, but for some reason it got categorized in that way. So I was happy to have the publicity, but at the same time, my view was that you don't really need a conspiracy theory to find a lot of the stuff very interesting and kind of crazy, I suppose. I feel that way about this recent book, The Wretched Atom, as well. And today, what I want to do is obviously, I'm going to try to focus on the things that I think are relevant to an environmental history group. So I won't discuss everything that's in the book, but I also want to say something about atomic history. And I think that there are some things about the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons and whatever you might say about that subject that is very kitschy. There's this term kitsch that is certainly used a lot in the United States, and we're talking about the material culture of the atomic age. Bobbleheads and Bert the Turtle and things of that nature that are really just sort of fun to think about. That's really not what this book is about. It's not about the kitsch. I kind of would like to get beyond that in thinking about the atomic era, because I do think that even though the era itself after World War II and afterward is intrinsically interesting, we also are continuing to deal with a lot of the issues that are raised in this book. I think probably part of the interest that people have in nuclear issues has to do with the continued threat from nuclear weapons, but also the continuing question about whether to adopt nuclear power. So I just want to address that at the beginning, that I do think we need to make sure that we're talking about the themes that are actually in the book. So one thing that I do in the book itself is to open with this conversation between three men. One of them is Houshang Ansari, who was the finance minister of Iran, and the president of the United States at the time was Gerald Ford. And Henry Kissinger, who is the most famous of the three, which is sort of ironic given the relative power of the three of them. And the reason I start with this conversation is because it is a great illustration of the use of science and technology in diplomacy and the use of a particular kind of promise. So the conversation kind of went like this, where Ford and Kissinger were promising nuclear power plants to Iran. And part of the promise was that Iran would, in a relatively short period of time, achieve the standard of living of Europeans and Americans. And, nuclear power plants were only part of this deal, which included infrastructural development and included, having telephones and all kinds of things in people's homes. And it also included, by the way, a lot of military equipment for Iran. The reason I opened the book with it is because there was a different conversation that happened a little bit earlier than this one that included Ansari, and that was between Kissinger and Ford and some other advisors, in which Kissinger said, if we can make one more deal like this, we will have broken OPEC. This is a very different way of thinking about the role of nuclear power and nuclear energy, I should say, and a very different way of looking at the role of technology in terms of promising it to a nation for one reason, but actually having an entirely different reason. Why is OPEC involved? Because the idea was that if the United States can convince Iran to adopt nuclear power, it will commit over a long period of time to very expensive projects that it would be very hard to stop selling oil to the United States. This was essentially a petroleum strategy. I like this as an opener of the book because it does a couple of things. It's no longer about nuclear power. It's no longer about whether or not we should adopt nuclear power. And suddenly it's not even really about nuclear weapons proliferation. Suddenly it's a conversation about oil, something completely different. I like that, not because the entire book is about oil, but rather because it gets us thinking about how useful the promise of the peaceful atom was to American politicians throughout all of the decades after the Second World War. And so it's just a kind of a provocative way of beginning the book. That's why I open with it. I'm trying to establish that the promise of the peaceful atom was extremely useful as a tool of state power. I mean, essentially, what I want to do in the book is to talk about atomic energy, talk about the peaceful side of it, and how embedded that promise of the peaceful atom was in all kinds of things, military things, economic things. So what's the wretched part of the title? I've already gotten some hate mail from people, particularly from pro-nuclear people, who assume they think that this is a takedown of nuclear power. It is not. It's neither pro nor against nuclear power per se. It is really about acknowledging this extraordinary moment in history right after the Second World War, where you have the efforts at reconstructing the world. It's an era of decolonization. It's an era of empires, of race and racism, of competition for resources such as oil, but also minerals such as uranium. And the question that I have in the book is, how did countries, especially the United States, but not only the United States, leverage its technology to maneuver in that world? So, full disclosure, the themes of the book, if you want to know, before I get into some of the details, it's essentially that the peaceful atom was a formidable tool of state power, of government power. For the United States, yes, but not just the United States. There are many countries that are featured in the book. A formidable tool of state power, leveraging aspirations of modernity, of mitigating natural resource shortfalls, avoiding environmental crises, all kinds of things that the peaceful atom was useful for promising. But not necessarily, the reasons were not necessarily sincere. Some of the themes that I developed include, reliance on this cornucopian vision of the atom. What is cornucopia? I have that in the title of the talk, I believe. A cornucopia just goes back to this old concept from the ancient Greeks, the idea of the horn of plenty, that something is coming out of this, the peace and plenty are coming out of this horn. So the cornucopia is a term that's, when you apply it to any kind of technology, certainly the nuclear energy, if you have a cornucopian vision of it, you imagine that it is a problem solver. It is going to provide plenty in terms of food. It's going to provide power. Is going to mitigate some of the problems that we have. It's a cornucopian vision. One of the things that I suppose differentiates this book from some other nuclear books is it really is about the role of governments in adopting this particular kind of version of a vision of a particular technology. Often in very insincere ways. So I don't want to go into all the sub themes of the book, but maybe I can get started on talking about some specifics. Here's a contrast. Both of them are famous photographs. Both of them may or may not be familiar to you. On the one on the left is 1953. This is a famous speech by Dwight Eisenhower to the United Nations, in which he introduced the concept of sharing nuclear technology with the rest of the world. This became known as the Atoms for Peace speech. It's one that we associate with the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's the one in which the United States, began to share with the rest of the world. Contrast it with 50 years later, you have, before the United Nations, Colin Powell, using evidence that was collected in part over the years by the International Atomic Energy Agency as a justification for going to war with Iraq. Now, I think of this as an extraordinary irony, where you have this promise being made that is supposed to be for the peaceful atom, and then ultimately is used as a justification for armed conflict. What I want to illustrate with that is just, again, how embedded the notion of the peaceful atom is in all these things. I think that when we learn about nuclear energy, it's sort of like when you were young and they say, well, are you going to be a humanities person or are you going to be a sciences person? And when you get older, you realize that there is not this complete separation between these things. The same is true of the notion of the peaceful atom and the military atom. The two are very much connected and they often go hand in hand. And one of the goals of the book is to try to show how connected those things are. So what's the wretched part of this? So the wretched part is not meant to be a slam on the atom per se, but rather to acknowledge this is a period in which many governments, including the United States, were trying to win the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. And that includes the countries of the developing world, what was called the developing world at the time. It borrows the concept that, in the United States, or in English, it's the book by Frantz Fanon, which was called Les Damnés de la Terre, the damned of the earth, was translated into the wretched of the earth in English. And it describes the people of the world who are the closest to danger from natural resource shortfalls, to possible environmental harm, starvation, poverty, and that what I'm trying to do in the book is to show how atomic energy became part of that promise, that we are going to use atomic energy to address the problems specifically of the developing world. So what kinds of promises are we talking about? If you're interested in nuclear energy or nuclear topics in general, typically you think nuclear weapons or you think nuclear energy for electricity generation. What actually got promised in the 1950s and 1960s were kind of different than that. Technologies that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't, like mutation plant breeding, where you're trying to develop miracle grains, increase the protein content, for example, of wheat or rice. Or if you're trying to use atomic energy, some sort of radioactive source in medicine, what you're looking at here is a range of photographs that are drawn from the International Atomic Energy Agency to promote itself. So from that era, we have, I don't know if I can go through all of them, but at least the top left is from Pakistan, and this is mutation plant breeding, developing a new kind of plant. Below that is the use of radioactive materials in thyroid cancer treatment. This is from Iran. Below that, you have two Iranian scientists being trained by International Atomic Energy Agency scientists. In the center, you have another miracle grain situation where you have rice being cultivated. Basically, mutation plant breeding is you irradiate the plant and then you grow it afterward, and you hope that some mutation has occurred that will give it some kind of benefit. On the right-hand side, you have this is a way of disease control where you irradiate flies. The flies are in the bags, and you have these flies, and they are supposed to outcompete flies that have not been irradiated, because if you irradiate them, they are no longer able to reproduce. And so you're trying to reduce the fly population. The reason you do that is because flies are a vector of disease. And then the other photograph there on the right bottom is a mobile training. It's a bus basically that where you're supposed to learn about radioisotopes. This was used a lot by this photograph was used a lot by the International Atomic Energy Agency. It looks kind of doctored to me, whereas you're sort of juxtaposing a photograph of the idea is here the juxtaposition of the primitive and the modern, where you have somebody, a farmer or someone who's leading his goats right next to this very modern seeming mobile radioisotope unit. So these are some of the range of promises. But the truth is that when the United States began to promise the peaceful atom, the government, and particularly Eisenhower, had no idea what to promise and no idea what any of these technologies might be. The goal for him was to distract, to try to give a peaceful, positive vision of the world in the time where, at that time, President Eisenhower was planning on ratcheting up the nuclear weapons arsenal. The United States was about to begin doing a series of nuclear tests in the Pacific. Many of you here will be familiar with these tests. They were the first major series of hydrogen bomb tests in which the detonations of the bombs were 1,000 times the size of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. So knowing that this was coming, the United States government needed to have something to propose to the world that seemed credible, but was not very specific. And that is precisely what the US did in proposing sharing of atomic technology, something that seemed credible, but they didn't have to follow through. That's kind of a theme of the book, proposing technologies that seem credible, but don't necessarily have to be real in order to be adopted. Because when you have something that's credible, that's future oriented, there's no real way of demonstrating whether it's real or not. So I want to talk a little bit about the propaganda. In the time that I have, I want to talk just about a few of the themes of the class, of the book. You can tell I've just come from teaching. These are famous propaganda posters that were developed by a company, General Dynamics. By the way, General Dynamics was a relatively new company. It actually was a rebranded company. It's an old company called Electric Boat that rebranded itself. It was a defense contractor that wanted to get into other things besides military things. And so rebranded itself as General Dynamics. And this particular company decided to collaborate with the Eisenhower government. By the way, the quote here, "might be able to run tractors," was this is a quote from Dwight Eisenhower, who didn't really have any idea what you might be able to do with atomic energy besides bombs. And he thought, well, maybe they might be able to run tractors with it. Which I find kind of amusing. These photographs became famous because they, for a couple of reasons. So one is that the graphic design in them became copied by a lot of different graphic designers. So if you look at the era of the 1950s and 1960s and look at atomic art, they come from these Erich Nietzsche posters that were designed for General Dynamics. These posters were on display at major conferences. The idea here is that you're trying to highlight technologies that can be non-military, the atom in the service of peace. If you look at the one on the right, this is the irony here, of course, is that this is a nuclear submarine, a naval vessel that is being called a peaceful thing. And I guess the idea is that it's nuclear propulsion, and it could conceivably be peaceful, but of course it was used in a military context. It became pretty well known after Walt Disney started talking about them. If you're familiar with Walt Disney, the American entertainer, of course, you've probably all seen Disney movies. At that time, we're talking about the mid-1950s, Walt Disney had already made a number of films and had made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I think he had made Peter Pan at this point. And the government thought of him as reliable, cooperative, and extremely prominent. That's a quote from the FBI, thinking we need somebody to help publicize the peaceful atom. And so Walt Disney did, in fact, cooperate with the US government to try to publicize the peaceful atom, to talk about, he created a short film called Our Friend the Atom. At that time, he was developing a theme park that became known as Disneyland. in which he was trying to figure out some futuristic technologies that he could feature in the theme park. It became known as Tomorrowland, and nuclear power became one of them. And you can see in the background that he's got those Eric Nietzsche posters from General Dynamics. They're kind of blurry. You can't tell that they're from General Dynamics, but Disney, who is pictured here, this is a still from the film. Disney himself was a great propagandist for the US government at that time. Very handy. Outside the United States, one thing that we don't really think about is the role of historical actors who are not American, who have their own reasons to be part of this promotion of peaceful technologies. So, one of them was Matsutaro Shoriki, who, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all the fascinating things about Shoriki, but Shoriki was somebody who was a newspaper owner. He owned one of the largest circulation newspapers in Tokyo, and was very prominent during World War II. And in fact, he was put on trial and sentenced to prison by the American occupation forces as being an imperial propagandist during the Japanese imperial period. But what he did, long story short, what he did after World War II was to convince the American occupation authorities that he would be actually a valuable ally to them in their own propaganda. And so he started working with the US government at first to in the first television stations that were developed in Japan. He was the owner of the first privately non-state owned, privately owned television network in Japan. And he got licenses from the US occupation government to do that in return for being a vehicle for propaganda. And he did the same thing for Atoms for Peace when it came about in the mid-1950s. At that time, there were a number of CIA officials who were working with Shoriki, trying to figure out what he was really doing. I mean, he was a newspaper owner. He ran for a seat in the Japanese Parliament, the Diet. And he was trying to become the Prime Minister of Japan. And there was a lot of discomfort with this, particularly between disagreements between the US State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, about whether it was wise to try to promote nuclear energy in Japan. So when I say working with this Japanese official, or the newspaper owner who became an official, what am I talking about? I'm talking about promoting peaceful nuclear energy in Japan as a way of counterbalancing the kind of warmongering status that the United States had at that time, turning around public opinion in a place that you would really expect it to be very difficult to turn opinion around in Japan. What I wanted to do in the book is to kind of focus on the role of these local actors. Instead of just thinking about how this is the success of US propaganda, instead think, well, what did Shoriki have to gain? Why did public opinion about nuclear energy turn around in Japan? The kinds of arguments that the US was making and that Shoriki was making was that Japan was an island nation, had these natural resource shortfalls, and that Japan would be better off having nuclear power. What did he actually want to do? Did he actually want to rearm Japan in the end? This is something that the CIA was very concerned about. Okay. I don't have too much time and I'd be happy to entertain questions more about Shoriki in the case of Japan. Japan was sort of a wake-up call for the US government about promising peaceful atomic energy, and the fact that there were some countries of the world that would take this promise very seriously. From the documents that I saw, it was very clear from the point of view of the US government, but also Europeans, that there were different kinds of atomic technologies. Some of them would be technologies of energy, of industrialization, and others would be technologies of agriculture and health. And there were scientists in India, scientists in Brazil who were very outspoken about how this seemed a heck of a lot like the classic colonial and imperial relationships. And it seemed to be that there were there were colored atoms and there were white atoms. That there was a kind of atomic energy that seemed, from the point of view of the US government, appropriate for Europeans and Americans, in other words, industrialization, electricity generation. And there seemed to be certain kinds of atomic energy that were appropriate for places like Japan, which was a recently defeated nation, places like India, a former colony, and that there were these scientists who said, no, what we want is nuclear energy. We want power, we want electricity. We don't want there to be this discrimination in the technologies themselves. And this was a very difficult pill to swallow for the Americans in particular, because they had conceptualized it very much in these terms that, hey, here are some technologies, agriculture, health, medicine, that seem to be appropriate for the rest of the world. They're not going to be able, or shouldn't necessarily be able, to have nuclear power for electricity. Japan was the first to challenge this because Shoriki was having none of it, the Japanese person I mentioned before, and definitely wanted to have nuclear power for electricity generation, because that would be a symbol of modernity. We see this again and again in nuclear history. Some of you are experts in the nuclear histories of specific countries, and I'm sure you can identify this. Certainly was the case in India, that India wanted to have nuclear energy, electricity generation, and was not accepting of this kind of atomic energy that seemed to be just for the colored part of the world, just seemed to be designed for carrying on this distinction between the colonial world and the industrialized world. What you're looking at here are just photographs from the first, this is a Geneva conference in 1955, in which the United States was was trying to prominently show all the different things that you could do with atomic energy, whether it's nuclear power, whether it's electricity generation, whether it's reactor, or whether it's improving your wheat. What you're looking at on the right is Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, posing for a photograph where he's clearly appreciating this wheat that is being shown to him by a scientist. The timing of this particular conference, 1955, which, if you're interested in atomic energy, the history of atomic energy, you may have heard of this conference in Geneva. The timing of it was very, very purposeful, because it was meant to kind of coincide with or happen before or slightly after, or around the same time as the Bandung conference of Asian and African states, where the United States was not invited, where the topic of conversation was destined to be race and racism and colonialism, and the Eisenhower administration was very keen to not be associated with that. And so, this is a moment it was a propaganda moment, but it was also one that a lot of countries really participated in. It was seen to be a great success from the point of view of the United States. This particular slide, I just want to, and I know that we're sort of running short on time, so I don't want to go into it too much, but I want to use this slide as an illustration of how the United States, European countries as well, had to choose the partners that they were working for. And while on the one hand, the United States did not want to be associated with racism, and the United States did not want to be associated with this idea that there are certain kinds of atomic energy, it also made some pretty fateful decisions for a number of reasons. So the person on the left is Hendrik Verwoerd, who was a leader of South Africa. And the person on the right is Kwame Nkrumah, who is the leader of Ghana in the mid-1960s. Both of them wanted to use atomic energy to pursue their own national aims. Both of them had robust atomic energy programs in their countries. Both of them adopted most of the ideals of the peaceful atom, but they had very different reasons for doing so. The United States sided with South Africa, mainly because of its access to uranium. And this is sort of a longer story than I can really get at here. But I'd be happy to talk more about this in the question and answer period. I guess if we're thinking about themes that I'm trying to get across, we have to think about the role of governments and their adoption of a particular way of promoting atomic energy. This particular slide is a great example of it, where you have in the 1960s, the US government started promoting nuclear power reactors in the Middle East as as a way of trying to mitigate environmental threats. There was this major crisis about water access in the 1960s, whether Israel was trying to get access to water, Jordan was trying to get access to water, Syria was trying to get access to water, and it was all from the same source. And so there's a lot of conflict over that. And so the US government proposed water for peace, and this idea of trying to get around this conflict about water access and instead using nuclear reactors, putting them on the coast of Israel and drawing water from the sea and desalinating that water and providing water in that way. This is a great example of what was supposed to be a technological solution to a source of conflict. The United States government pushed it pretty hard in the late 1960s. But I guess tellingly, when President Johnson decided that he didn't want to run again for president, the project completely evaporated. The last thing I kind of want to sort of mention in the context of promoting these kinds of solutions, even though every president from Eisenhower forward had a different way of promoting atomic energy, what's consistent is that they did adopt a cornucopian message, that they did say that this is something that can be used, it can be quite useful for lots of different countries of the world, and that you should invest in nuclear technology in some way. Of course, the tricky part about that is that lots of people who will develop nuclear reactors will also want to build bombs. In the United States, there's a lot of discussion in my book about the role of the peaceful nuclear explosive, and how after you had the Chinese bomb in 1964 and the Indian bomb in 1974, it became very difficult for the United States to continue its own vision of providing peaceful nuclear explosives when it was trying to prevent other countries from doing so. All right. For some reason, I'm being quite. I'm looking at my clock, and I've lost a little bit of track of how much time I have. So what I want to do is maybe just talk a little bit about, I feel like I'm glossing over a lot of very complicated issues here. So I hope that you'll ask questions so I can clarify my views on them. On the last thing that I'll say is that, as and this is something that's really key for a group like this that's interested in environmental history, the conversations that we have today about nuclear power are really not unique to this time. There's this, I just have a picture of an op-ed here. I'm sure you have seen arguments like this, where you will have, hey, we need to have nuclear power. Nuclear power can save the world. And in fact, it's something that we can, that can help to mitigate any number of environmental crises. It is the answer to climate change. What I kind of want to say about that is to not critique the idea that nuclear power is, something that doesn't put fossil fuels into, doesn't burn fossil fuels, but rather for us to recognize that this is a very commonly done technique by governments to promote the cornucopian possibility of the atom. But what I try to show in the book is that these arguments are often deployed for entirely different reasons, regardless of whether it's true or not. That pointing out the cornucopian side of atomic energy is a kind of tried and true technique of a lot of different governments, whether you have the US government doing it for propaganda reasons and other presidents doing it for a variety of reasons over the years, or you have the French government doing it for energy security reasons, or you have the debates in Germany, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, about that are in part about climate change, but really are also a part about not wanting to rely on gas from Russia and any number of other things. But that this cornucopian message about the peaceful atom is extremely powerful and continues to be so. And also that every government in the world that has ever developed nuclear weapons has, after the United States, has started with this peaceful, the rhetoric of the peaceful atom, and adopting all kinds of programs that seem to be peaceful. Going back briefly to South Africa and Ghana, one of the overall points that can be made about this is that the peaceful atom also becomes a vehicle for engagement in the international arena. South Africa is just a great case of this, where by the 1960s and certainly by the 1970s, South Africa was an international pariah. It had very racist policies, as you all know, and it was very difficult to engage with South Africa in any meaningful way. And yet it had a heck of a lot of uranium. And so the United States needed to engage, felt it needed to engage with South Africa. And the way that it was able to do so was through the International Atomic Energy Agency, because it was the one big international organization that South Africa continued to be involved in, and it was supposed to be a technical organization, and so you weren't supposed to bring in politics. But the United States certainly found a way of engaging with South Africa in that way. So the themes that, again, I'm trying to hammer on today have to do with the peaceful atom being that formidable tool of state power, leveraging those aspirations of modernity for a lot of countries in the world. But I also don't want to make it a story of just the United States pulling the wool over the world's eyes. Every nation that has ever adopted atomic energy, whether bombs or otherwise, have adopted these cornucopian messages, cornucopian interpretations of the peaceful atom for whatever purposes they might have. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and maybe we can have a question and answer period.